Hi everyone, and welcome to Mod 6.2 to 6.3. Here are the structures of the brain, here are the learning objectives, and here are the vocab. Alright, so we're going to talk about three main divisions of the brain. In the innermost part of our brain, the oldest, most primitive part of our brain, we have the brainstem. I want you to hold your fist like this and remember that this is the brainstem. This keeps us alive. It's the oldest, most primitive part. And we're going to talk about three main divisions. So this is the innermost, kind of like the core of a lollipop. And then there's going to be one more and a third, okay? So the brainstem, basic survival. So inside of the brainstem, there are three parts of the brain that you need to know. There are other parts, but we're going to focus on three key parts. The first one is the medulla. The medulla is essential to life, as the brainstem talks about, because it controls heartbeat and breathing. Okay, so medulla, think heartbeat and breathing. The next one that you need to know is the thalamus. So the thalamus is this part here on the top of the brainstem, and this I want you to think of Thad. So thalamus, I want you to think of Thad, okay? He is a mailman, and he delivers all sensory information except for smell, because he does not have a nose. So I want you to picture Thad the mailman without a nose. He's just an empty space here where he should have a nose, and that's because he is the messenger for all sensory information, hearing, touch, vision, everything. But he can't send smells because he doesn't have a nose. So that's Thad, the thalamus. The last one inside the brainstem that you need to know is the reticular formation. So reticular formation is important for our level of arousal. It helps us be alert. So I mean arousal in the sense of being awake or unconscious. So if we stimulated the reticular formation, it would wake people up. If your reticular formation is damaged, you could, for example, be in a coma. You would be unable to be alert, awake. All right, now this part is connected to the brainstem, and this is not in one of the three divisions. This is kind of separate. It's like a little brain. If you look at it right here, it's shaped sort of like a little brain. And this, I want you to remember balance and coordination. The cerebellum is important for balance and coordination. All right, now we're going to move on to the second division of the brain. So we have the brainstem. Now we're going to go like this with our other hand. I hope you're doing this at home because it helps you learn it. So this is our limbic system. This is the second most evolved. And this does things that are a little more complex because each time we're going to get more complex. So this is going to handle our emotions and some other things that are helpful for survival of the species and helpful for survival. These three parts of the limbic system that we need to know for this class are the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus. So let's start with the amygdala. So when you think amygdala, I want you to think fear and aggression. Fear and aggression. Because those are the strongest alerts that our amygdala sends out. So it's responsible for basic emotions. Fear and aggressive are some of our most primal emotions. So one way to remember this is you can think of Amy G. Amygdala, if you will. Amy G is afraid. She is afraid to come out of her house. She has her blinds shut and she's peeking through her blinds very carefully, looking out into the world. Amy G is afraid. All right. Another part of our limbic system is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus does a lot of things. So the way that we can kind of condense this and make it easy to remember is that the hypothalamus does the 5 F's. Okay? And a lot of textbooks call it the 4 F's. And then a couple years ago, my class and I, we added on a 5th just to make it work because it does something else. So the 4 F's, and this is coming from textbooks, I didn't make this up. The 4 F's are fighting, feeding, fleeing, and mating. Yes. It is also it's in a lot of textbooks. The so-called 4 F's, fighting, fleeing, feeding, and mating. Okay? So those are things that the hypothalamus does. Now the 5th F that my class and I came up with was furnace. And that is because the hypothalamus regulates our body temperature. So it's not that it keeps it warm, so it's not a perfect word, but it regulates our body temperature. All right, so the hippocampus. This is the part of our brain that is responsible for new memories. It is not a part of our brain that holds all of our memories. There is no one part of our brain that holds all of our memories, but this is responsible for new memories. So for hippocampus, I want you to remember a hippo on campus. Okay. So now we're on to the 3rd division of the brain. So this is usually when I would say find a friend, and one person would be doing the brainstem, the limbic system, and then the last person would do this over top of that. So this is the cerebral cortex. This is the most complex part of our brain, the most evolved part of our brain. So it's basically where information gets interconnected, where we have like critical thinking and planning and judgment. It's your ultimate information processing center. If you flattened it out, it would be the size of a large pizza. All right, so the cortex is divided into 4 different divisions. So the frontal lobe is right here, as you can see in this picture. So the way we can remember this is the frontal lobe is it's up here. And this is where, like, if you're thinking about something or you're like scratching your head and like wondering and planning and deciding, all of those things that the frontal lobe does, they happen right here. So remember this hand gesture where you're scratching your forehead or scratching your head and you're like, what should I do? Frontal lobe. The parietal lobe is the top rear part of the brain right here. And this is sensory input and touch. So for this one, I want you to think of washing your hair. And that's a sensation, right? Like of the bubbles, of you scratching your head. And so that is responsible for sensory and touch information. The occipital lobe is in the back of our heads. So if you've ever heard the expression eyes in the back of your head, that's where our occipital lobe is. The reason that we can see isn't just because of these eyeballs. The reason we can see is because of this, the eyeballs in the back of our head. So I want you to think about eyes in the back of your head. The last one is temporal lobe. So think of the word tempo. The temporal lobe is here by our ears. And if we are trying to listen to the tempo, we might go like this to try to hear what's happening. So when you touch your ears, think tempo, listen. Those are the 4 lobes. All right, so now let's go inside those 4 lobes. So the motor cortex is in the frontal lobe, and this is responsible for voluntary movement. So that judgment planning part of our brain also houses the part that we control our hands and legs and things like that. That's what the motor cortex does. Controls me moving my head, me moving my hand. The somatosensory cortex, right next to that, processes our body's touch and movement sensation. So here is a picture of this kind of laid out. So the more space in the brain devoted to that part of our body, the stronger the sensations we feel. So this guy right here, homunculus, is sensory homunculus, and his hands are really big because those are more sensitive and we control more, we have more movement sensation in our hands. We also have more movement sensation in our lips and our tongue and our ears than we do, for example, our calf muscles. So their size is representative of how much space our brain gets for that. The more space of the brain, the more we feel in that part of the brain. All right. And so finally, taking all of this information about the brain and understanding that as we grow, our brain develops and changes. Remember, your brain is not fully developed until you're closer to 30 years old. And if our brain is damaged or we are blind, our brain will adapt. If our brain is damaged in a certain part, someone has a stroke and they have trouble walking, that can be repaired. The brain has plasticity, which means neural tissue can reorganize and rebuild. We didn't always know this about the brain, but we have learned this through various situations. All right, so takeaways. Remember the 3 divisions of the brain: brainstem, limbic system, cerebral cortex. Remember the hypothalamus houses the 5 Fs: feeding, fighting, fleeing, sex, and furnace. The brain cerebral cortex is divided up into 4 lobes. So remember that: listening to the tempo, eyes in the back of our head, washing our hair, scratching our head. Remember hippocampus. I didn't go over that one. So hippocampus is just like, think of a hippo in his first day on the college campus, and he's making new memories. Amygdala, think of, she's a shut-in, she's afraid to go out into the world. And then Thad the mailman, all sensory info except smell because he doesn't have a nose. So that sums up mod 6.2 to 6.3, and I will see you in class.